You think you know war, you think you know history, but the English Civil War, a conflict that tore a kingdom apart, executed a king in broad daylight, and rewired the entire modern world from the roots upward, is packed with secrets so strange, so dark, and so utterly bizarre that most history books quietly left them out. We are talking about a poodle accused of being a witch's familiar, a king who wore two shirts to his own execution so he would not appear afraid, a skull that spent decades as a fairground curiosity before being secretly buried at a Cambridge college, a communist commune on a Surrey hillside, a farmer who became a military dictator, 99 facts that will change everything you thought you knew about England, about power, and about the world we still live in today. Settle in. This is going to be a long and extraordinary night. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Fact number 1. The English Civil War was not one war, it was 3. Most people hear the phrase English Civil War and picture a single bloody conflict, but historians actually identify 3 distinct wars. The First Civil War ran from 1642 to 1646. The Second Civil War erupted in 1648. The Third Civil War stretched from 1650 to 1651. Each war had its own triggers, its own alliances, and its own brutal character. The man at the centre of all 3 was King Charles I, whose stubborn belief in his own divine right to rule without answering to Parliament made him the most divisive monarch England had ever seen. By the time it was all over, England had been turned inside out, and the world of kings who ruled by God alone was gone forever. The First Civil War ended with the king a prisoner. The second ended with him a condemned man. The third ended with his son a fugitive hiding in an oak tree. 3 wars, 3 catastrophes, 1 kingdom that would never be quite the same again. Fact number 2. The war started over a prayer book. Not guns, not taxes, a prayer book. In 1637, King Charles I and his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, attempted to force a new Anglican prayer book on the Presbyterian Scots. When the book was first read aloud at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, the congregation erupted. A market trader named Jenny Geddes, according to popular legend, hurled her stool at the Dean and screamed that he dared say Mass in her ear. Riots followed. Scotland rebelled. Charles needed money to raise an army, which meant he had to call Parliament back into session after 11 years of ruling without it. That decision started the chain of events that would cost him his head. The stool Jenny Geddes supposedly threw is still displayed in St. Giles Cathedral today, a small wooden object that carries on its shoulders the weight of a revolution. Fact number 3. Charles I ruled for 11 years without Parliament at all. From 1629 to 1640, Charles governed England in what became known as the personal rule, or what his enemies called the 11 Years' Tyranny. He dissolved Parliament 3 times before finally giving up on it entirely and deciding he simply did not need those troublesome members of the House of Commons telling him what to do. To fund the crown without parliamentary taxation, he revived ancient feudal levies and fines. He charged landowners for technically living within royal forests that had not been forests for centuries. He imposed ship money, a tax traditionally levied only on coastal towns on the entire country. People were furious. When he finally had to call Parliament back in 1640, the resentment had been building for over a decade. A gentleman farmer named John Hampden had already gone to court rather than pay ship money, and his trial had turned him into a national hero. The kindling was dry long before anyone struck the match. Fact number 4. The parliamentarians called themselves the Godly. You might have learned the 2 sides as Roundheads versus Cavaliers, and those nicknames did exist. But the parliamentarian side had a much grander name for themselves. They called themselves the Godly. They genuinely believed they were carrying out the work of God against a corrupt king who was sliding England back toward Catholicism. Their confidence in divine backing made them extraordinarily ferocious fighters and deeply inflexible negotiators. Every battlefield victory confirmed to them that God was on their side. Every defeat was a test of faith to overcome. This theological certainty shaped the entire character of the parliamentary cause and eventually produced Oliver Cromwell, a man who fused military genius with absolute religious conviction. When Cromwell wrote home after a great victory, he did not take personal credit. He attributed everything to the Lord of Hosts. He meant it completely. Fact number 5. Oliver Cromwell was a complete nobody before the war. Before 1640, Oliver Cromwell was a minor gentleman farmer from Huntingdon. He had served briefly as an MP, but made no particular impression on anyone. He was nearly 40 years old and had spent most of his adult life managing his modest lands and raising his family. He had suffered what appears to have been a serious religious crisis in his 30s, a period of profound despair followed by a transformative conversion experience that left him utterly convinced he was an instrument of God. When war came, this obscure farmer turned himself into the finest cavalry commander England had ever produced, and then into the de facto ruler of the entire country. It is one of the most extraordinary transformations in all of British history. Men who had dismissed him as a nobody in 1640 were taking orders from him by 1650, and those who refused were in prison or exile. Fact number 6. The Cavaliers got their nickname as an insult. The word cavalier originally came from the Spanish caballero, meaning horseman or knight. In the political climate of the 1640s, being associated with anything Spanish meant being suspected of Catholic sympathies. Parliamentarian propagandists threw the word at the king's supporters as a slur, implying they were arrogant, foreign-influenced, and dangerously Catholic in their leanings. The Royalists turned it around and wore it with pride, embracing the image of the dashing, romantic, aristocratic warrior loyal to his king. Similarly, Roundhead, another insult, originally mocked the short-cropped hair of London apprentices and Puritan tradesmen who supported Parliament. Both sides eventually wore their insults as badges of honour. This pattern of a political insult being reclaimed as a badge of identity would repeat itself throughout history, but the Cavaliers and Roundheads were among the first to do it with such conscious flair. Fact number 7. The first major battle ended in a complete mess. The Battle of Edgehill on the 23rd of October 1642 was the first major pitched battle of the war, and it ended in total confusion. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the king's brilliant but impetuous cavalry commander, led a devastating charge that smashed through the parliamentary horse on one flank. The problem was that Rupert's cavalry kept going. They charged all the way off the battlefield and spent time looting the parliamentary baggage train, miles away, while the rest of the infantry fought without their cavalry support. When Rupert finally returned, the battle had descended into a grinding stalemate. Both sides camped on the field overnight and then essentially walked away. Neither side could claim a decisive victory, and the war that everyone expected to be over in weeks stretched on for years. The lesson of Edgehill haunted the royalist cause all the way to final defeat. Fact number 8. Prince Rupert had a famous white poodle named Boy. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, Charles I's dashing nephew and the most feared cavalry commander of the war, was accompanied everywhere by a large white hunting poodle named Boy. Parliamentary propagandists, desperately trying to undermine Rupert's terrifying reputation, produced pamphlets claiming that Boy was a witch's familiar, that he was bulletproof, that he could catch bullets in his mouth, that he could find buried treasure, that he spoke multiple languages, and that he could transform himself into various shapes at will. They were deeply serious about these claims. Boy was killed at the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, and the parliamentarians celebrated his death in their propaganda as a significant spiritual victory. A poodle had become a genuine piece of wartime psychological warfare. The pamphlets attacking Boy are today considered early masterpieces of political satire, though their authors intended every word in deadly earnest. Fact number 9. Thousands of women fought or actively participated in the war. While the armies were formally composed of men, women across England played active and sometimes directly military roles in the conflict. During sieges, women inside fortified towns and houses helped defend the walls, carried ammunition, put out fires caused by flaming projectiles, and in some cases, fought hand-to-hand. Lady Mary Banks defended Corfe Castle in Dorset for over a year and a half while her husband was away, leading the garrison through 2 sieges before finally being betrayed from within. Other women acted as spies, messengers, surgeons, and suppliers. The upheaval of war gave some women access to roles and experiences that their ordinary lives would never have permitted. When the wars ended and men returned, women were pushed back into domestic roles, but the memory of what they had done and what they had proven could not be entirely erased. Fact number 10. The City of London was the key to everything. Parliament controlled London from the very beginning of the war, and this single fact shaped everything that followed. London was by far the largest city in England, home to perhaps 400,000 people, at a time when the next largest English cities had populations of perhaps 30,000. London generated an enormous proportion of England's total wealth and tax revenue. London's trained bands, its civilian militia, were numerous and surprisingly effective. When the King's army threatened London after Edgehill and could perhaps have taken the city, the London-trained bands marched out to Turnham Green and faced them down with such numbers that Charles retreated. He never had that opportunity again. Whoever held London held England, and Parliament never lost it. The city's merchant wealth financed the war, its printing presses fought the propaganda battle, and its population provided a reservoir of manpower that the Royalists could never match. Fact number 11. There were soldiers who had no idea which side they were actually fighting for. In the chaos of the early war, with loyalties shifting and armies passing through regions that had no strong affiliation either way, individual soldiers sometimes genuinely did not know who they were fighting alongside or against. Uniforms in the modern sense did not exist. Both sides wore similar clothes. The identification systems of the day, coloured scarves or ribbons, field signs like leaves or pieces of paper tucked into hatbands, were easily lost or copied. In the fog of battle, men on the same side shot at each other. At the Battle of Marston Moor, parliamentarian forces mistakenly attacked their own Scottish allies in the darkness. Battlefield confusion was not just common. It was almost universal. The wonder is not that mistakes were made, but that battles reached any conclusion at all, given the chaos in which they were fought. Fact number 12. The New Model Army was revolutionary in the history of warfare. In the winter of 1644 to 1645, Parliament reorganised its scattered, quarrelling regional armies into a single unified national force. The New Model Army was different from anything England had seen before. It was professional. It was paid regularly, or at least more regularly than most armies of the time. It was trained to a common standard. It was promoted on merit rather than on social rank. A man of no family could rise to command if he was good enough. Cromwell himself insisted on this. The army's chaplains preached constantly among the men, fostering a culture of intense religious debate and collective spiritual identity. The New Model Army did not just win the war, it became a political force in its own right, eventually purging Parliament itself. No English king would ever again face a professional army loyal to the people rather than the crown without remembering what the New Model Army had done. Fact number 13. The siege of Basing House lasted 2 years. Basing House in Hampshire, the largest private house in England, was the home of the Marquis of Winchester, a devout Catholic and passionate royalist. Parliament besieged it from 1643. The defenders held out through continuous bombardment, starvation, disease, and repeated assaults for over 2 years. When Oliver Cromwell himself finally arrived to take command of the besieging forces in October 1645, he brought heavy artillery and breached the walls within 2 days. The storming of Basing House was extraordinarily brutal. Several hundred defenders were killed, including priests and civilians. The great house was systematically looted and then burned to the ground. Among those present during the siege was the famous architect Inigo Jones, who was found inside wrapped in a blanket and carried out to safety. He was 71 years old at the time. The ruins of Basing House still stand today, silent and grassy, one of the most atmospheric Civil War sites in England. Fact number 14. Soldiers on both sides went barefoot for months at a time. The logistics of 17th century armies were appalling by any modern standard. Supply systems broke down constantly. Pay arrived months late or not at all. Food was routinely inadequate. But one of the most persistent and agonizing shortages was footwear. The soldiers marched enormous distances over all kinds of terrain in leather shoes that wore out quickly, and when they wore out, there were frequently no replacements. Armies on campaign regularly featured large numbers of barefoot men, hobbling along roads, picking their way through fields, fighting battles with bleeding feet. After victories, the first thing soldiers did was strip boots and shoes from the dead. It was not cruelty, it was survival. Quartermasters who managed to supply a regiment with adequate footwear were remembered as heroes by the men they served. A small detail that says everything about the daily reality of 17th century warfare. Fact number 15. Charles I kept trying to negotiate while simultaneously plotting to continue the war. Even after his military defeat was essentially complete by 1646, Charles refused to accept the reality of his situation. While he sat in various forms of captivity, negotiating with Parliament, with the Scots, and with the New Model Army, he was simultaneously writing secret letters to France, to Ireland, and to anyone else who might help him restart the war on better terms. He promised different things to different parties, knowing perfectly well that some of his promises contradicted others. He trusted that by playing his captors against each other, he could eventually regain full power. Parliament and Cromwell gradually came to the conclusion that there was simply no deal to be done with Charles. He would never genuinely accept limits on his power. The trial and execution that followed were the direct result of that conclusion, and Charles went to his death still believing he was right. Fact number 16. There was a group called the Diggers who tried to build a communist community on a Surrey hill. In April 1649, a group of poor men and women, led by Gerard Winstanley, climbed St. George's Hill in Surrey and began digging up the common land to plant crops. They called themselves the True Levellers, though history remembers them as the Diggers. Winstanley believed that the earth was a common treasury for all, that private property was the source of all oppression, and that true freedom meant common ownership of the land. Their colony attracted perhaps a few dozen people at its peak. Local landowners were furious. Their crops were repeatedly destroyed and their huts burned. They were prosecuted and physically driven off. The experiment lasted barely a year, but Winstanley's pamphlets articulated a vision of society so radical that they remained controversial and inspiring for centuries afterward. Gerard Winstanley is now studied in universities across the world as one of the first theorists of communism. A man 3 centuries ahead of his time who spent his life in poverty for his beliefs. Fact number 17. The Levellers were an extraordinary democratic movement 3 centuries ahead of their time. The Levellers were a political movement that emerged from within the New Model Army itself, drawing support from common soldiers and London tradesmen and artisans. They published documents like the Agreement of the People, which called for a written constitution, universal male suffrage, freedom of religion, equality before the law, and the abolition of imprisonment for debt. In the context of 1647, these ideas were staggeringly radical. Cromwell and the senior army officers engaged with them in the famous Putney debates, where Leveller representatives argued directly with generals over the future shape of English society. Cromwell ultimately suppressed the Levellers, imprisoning their leaders and crushing a mutiny, but their ideas entered the bloodstream of English and later American political thought. The Agreement of the People is today recognized as one of the foundational documents of modern democracy. Fact number 18. The Putney debates featured common soldiers arguing constitutional theory with generals. In October and November of 1647, the New Model Army gathered at St. Mary's Church in Putney for a series of extraordinary debates about the future of England. Common soldiers, not just officers, sat alongside generals, including Cromwell and his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and argued directly about whether England should have a written constitution, who should be allowed to vote, and what rights citizens were entitled to by nature. A soldier named Thomas Rainsborough made one of the most quoted speeches of the entire 17th century, arguing that the poorest man in England had a life to live as the greatest, and therefore ought to have a voice in the government he lived under. These debates were never published at the time. The transcript was found in the Clark Papers centuries later. Fact number 19. King Charles I was formally tried for treason against his own people. The trial of King Charles I was an event without precedent in European history. A sitting monarch was put on trial by his own subjects for tyranny and treason against the people of England. Charles refused to recognize the court's authority. He refused to enter a plea. He repeatedly insisted that no court on earth had the jurisdiction to try a king. He was not entirely wrong, as a matter of law as it stood at the time. His prosecutors, knowing they could not rebut this argument, simply proceeded anyway, citing the principle that kings held their authority in trust for the people and could forfeit it by tyranny. Charles conducted himself with great dignity throughout. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. The trial established a precedent that rulers are not above the law, a principle so obvious now and so revolutionary then that it is difficult to fully appreciate the courage it took to assert it. Fact number 20. The execution of Charles I shocked the entire world. On the 30th of January 1649, King Charles I was led out of the banqueting house in Whitehall and beheaded on a scaffold in the street outside. The crowd's reaction, according to eyewitnesses, included a great groan, a collective sound of shock and grief that spread through the thousands watching. Whatever people thought of Charles as a ruler, this was an unimaginable act. A king anointed by God, the highest human being in the traditional order of the world, had been treated as a common criminal and killed in public. Across Europe, the reaction was one of horror and disbelief. The King of France was reportedly so shocked he was speechless. Charles conducted himself on the scaffold with complete composure, speaking calmly about the nature of kingship and Christian duty until the axe fell. The scaffold had been built directly outside the banqueting house, whose ceiling Rubens had painted with images of royal divinity, a location so deliberately symbolic it could only have been chosen with conscious intent. Fact number 21. The executioner's identity has never been definitively established. Despite the enormous public spectacle of Charles I's execution, the identity of the man who actually swung the axe has never been conclusively proven. Both the executioner and his assistant wore masks and disguises. The names of Richard Brandon, the official public executioner, and various others have been put forward over the centuries. Brandon himself denied it on his deathbed. Some believe he was paid an enormous sum and ordered to do it regardless of his personal feelings. The deliberate concealment of the executioner's identity suggests that even those who ordered the execution knew they were doing something whose consequences might eventually require anonymity for the man who carried out the act. 3.5 centuries later, historians are still arguing about who held the axe on that January morning. Fact number 22. Charles I wore 2 shirts to his execution so he would not shiver and appear afraid. One of the most poignant and human details of Charles I's execution was his decision, on a freezing January morning, to wear an extra shirt beneath his usual clothing. He explained his reasoning clearly. He did not want the crowd to see him shiver in the cold and mistake it for trembling from fear. He wanted to meet his death with composed dignity and did not want any ambiguity about his state of mind. This detail, recorded by those present, reveals a great deal about the king's character. Whatever his failures as a ruler, in his final hours, he was preparing his own appearance with the meticulous concern of a man who understood the political theatre of what was happening and intended to control the one thing still within his power. He stepped onto the scaffold and died as he had lived, performing kingship to the last possible moment. Charles met death with the composure of a man who had been preparing for it mentally for years, and who had decided that how he died would be the last statement he would ever make about what it meant to be a king. Fact number 23. After Charles was executed, people rushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs in his blood. Immediately after the execution, according to contemporary accounts, a significant number of people in the crowd pushed forward and dipped their handkerchiefs and pieces of cloth into the blood pooling on the scaffold. This was not an act of ghoulish curiosity. It was the behavior of people who believed they were in the presence of a martyr's blood. The medieval tradition of royal blood as sacred and healing ran deep in popular consciousness. Relics of holy persons were believed to have miraculous properties. Despite the official condemnation of such Catholic-flavoured beliefs by the very Protestants who had just cut the king's head off, the impulse to preserve something physical of this extraordinary moment overwhelmed any theological reservations. Those blood-soaked cloths were hidden in drawers and attics across England for decades, brought out only in secret, treasured in silence. The blood-soaked handkerchiefs hidden in drawers across England represent something important about the gap between official ideology and popular feeling, and about the stubborn persistence of older ways of thinking about sacred power. Fact number 24. The Royalists turned Charles I into a saint almost immediately. Within days of the execution, a book called Icon Basilicae, meaning the royal image, was published. It was presented as Charles's own meditations and prayers written in captivity, a kind of spiritual autobiography of a suffering and pious king wronged by his subjects. It was almost certainly not written entirely by Charles himself. It was largely the work of John Gordon, a clergyman, but it was extraordinarily effective propaganda. It went through dozens of editions in its first year alone. It transformed the executed king into a martyred saint in popular imagination. Charles II would later have his father formally added to the Church of England's calendar of saints, where he remains to this day as King Charles the Martyr. In some Anglican churches, a special service is still held on the 30th of January each year to commemorate him. Fact number 25. England briefly became a republic called the Commonwealth. After the execution of the king, England had no king, no House of Lords, and a parliament that had been reduced by military purge to a small rump of members acceptable to the army. In May 1649, this body declared England a Commonwealth and free state. For the first time in its history, England was a republic. It was a deeply strange and fragile entity. Much of the country remained royalist in sympathy. Scotland immediately proclaimed Charles II as king. Ireland was in revolt. The army was the real power behind everything. The Commonwealth limped along, fighting wars in Ireland, Scotland, and at sea, surviving on the energy and military skill of Oliver Cromwell, until it finally gave way to an even stranger arrangement. The Republic lasted 11 years in various forms, and when it ended, virtually nobody mourned it openly, which said everything about how it had governed. The Commonwealth was a republic that nobody had really planned for, governed by men who disagreed profoundly about what it was for, sustained only by the military genius of one man, and it collapsed the moment that man was no longer there to hold it together. Fact number 26. Cromwell's campaign in Ireland was catastrophically brutal. In August 1649, Oliver Cromwell arrived in Ireland with the new model army to suppress a royalist and Catholic Confederate uprising. What followed left scars on Irish national memory that are still raw today. At Drogheda in September 1649, after the garrison refused to surrender, Cromwell ordered no quarter. Approximately 2,000 soldiers and an unknown number of civilians were killed. At Wexford shortly afterward, a similar massacre occurred. Cromwell's own letters described these killings as the righteous judgment of God on those who had slaughtered Protestants in the 1641 uprising. The wider campaign resulted in enormous depopulation of Ireland through killing, famine, and the transportation of thousands of Irish people to work in the West Indies as indentured labourers, a practice some historians have described as a form of slavery. The name Cromwell remains, to this day, one of the most reviled in Irish history. The wounds inflicted by the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland are among the deepest and most lasting in the history of the British Isles, and they have shaped Irish national identity, Irish-British relations, and the Irish diaspora in ways that are still actively felt. Fact number 27. Cromwell dissolved Parliament by walking in with soldiers and shouting at MPs. In April 1653, after years of frustration with the Rump Parliament's failure to pursue the godly reforms he believed that the war had been fought for, Oliver Cromwell's patience finally snapped. He summoned a company of musketeers, walked into the House of Commons, and delivered an extraordinary tirade at the assembled members. He told them they were no parliament, that they had sat too long for any good they were doing, that they should depart and let the country have done with them. He pointed at individual MPs and insulted them personally. He grabbed the parliamentary mace, the symbol of Parliament's authority, declared it a fool's bauble, and had it carried out. The soldiers cleared the chamber. This was the man who had fought a civil war partly about parliamentary rights. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room or on history. Fact number 28. England was briefly ruled by a council of religious extremists called the Barebones Parliament. After dissolving the Rump Parliament, Cromwell tried something extraordinary. Instead of calling elections, he assembled a nominated parliament whose members were selected for their godliness rather than elected by constituencies. It became known as the Barebones Parliament after one of its more memorably named members, a leather merchant called Praise God Barbon, whose actual name was Praise God Barebone. This assembly of sober Puritans almost immediately split between radical reformers who wanted to abolish the established church, transform the legal system root and branch, and usher in a godly utopia, and more moderate members who were horrified by the radicals' ambitions. After 5 months, the moderate majority voted to dissolve themselves and hand power back to Cromwell. The experiment in theocratic democracy was over, but the name Barebones Parliament has echoed through English political satire ever since. The Barebones Parliament is a cautionary tale about what happens when you select representatives for their religious enthusiasm rather than their political ability, and it confirmed to Cromwell that godliness and governance were not the same thing. Fact number 29. Cromwell was offered the crown and turned it down. In 1657, After years of ruling as Lord Protector under a written constitution, Oliver Cromwell was formally offered the crown of England by Parliament. The offer was made repeatedly and with great seriousness. Many in Parliament genuinely believed that making Cromwell king would stabilise the country, restore a familiar and understood constitutional order, and secure the gains of the revolution. Cromwell agonised over the decision for weeks. He consulted his senior officers, his chaplains, his closest advisers. In the end, he declined, citing his conscience, his conversations with God, and his belief that kingship was a form that God had condemned through the events of the Civil War. He continued to exercise royal-level power under the title of Lord Protector, but without the crown. His refusal was genuine and cost him real political stability. The succession crisis that followed his death showed exactly what he had sacrificed by saying no. Cromwell's refusal of the crown was a genuine act of principle in a political career that contained several acts of considerable, unprincipled pragmatism, and it deserves more credit than it usually receives from the historians who have found his career as a whole too uncomfortable to admire straightforwardly. Fact number 30. Cromwell died of a combination of malaria and a urinary infection. Oliver Cromwell died on the 3rd of September 1658, the anniversary of his two greatest military victories at Dunbar and Worcester, a coincidence that his supporters found spiritually significant. He had been seriously ill for weeks, suffering from what contemporaries described as an ague, now thought to be malarial fever, complicated by a urinary infection that may have involved kidney stones. He was 59 years old. His death threw the entire political settlement into crisis. His son Richard was named as his successor, but Richard was a modest country gentleman with no taste for power or politics. He resigned after 8 months, and the careful structure Cromwell had built collapsed into chaos that ultimately led to the restoration of the monarchy. History rarely produces a more dramatic demonstration of the danger of building a system around one irreplaceable man. Richard Cromwell, gentle, decent, completely unsuited to the position he had inherited, lasted 8 months as Lord Protector, before resigning with a relief that was probably entirely genuine, leaving behind a political vacuum that nobody knew how to fill. Fact number 31. Cromwell's body was dug up after the monarchy was restored and hanged. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against the principal regicides, those who had signed the death warrant of Charles I. Many were already dead. Cromwell, who had died in 1658 and been given a magnificent state funeral with burial in Westminster Abbey, was among the dead who were subject to posthumous punishment. In January 1661, exactly 12 years after Charles I's execution, Cromwell's body was exhumed from Westminster Abbey, along with those of Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw. The corpses were dressed in their shrouds and hanged at Tyburn, the public gallows, for a full day. At sunset, they were cut down. Cromwell's head was severed and displayed on a spike on the roof of Westminster Hall, where it remained for approximately 20 years until a storm finally blew it down. Fact number 32. Cromwell's head passed through many hands over the centuries. After Cromwell's head was finally blown off its spike in a storm around 1685, its subsequent history reads like something from a very dark comedy. It was reportedly picked up by a guard and hidden. It passed through various hands over the following centuries, appearing at different times as a curiosity, a fairground exhibit, and a collector's piece. Various heads were displayed at various times, claiming to be Cromwell's genuine skull. In 1960, after decades of scientific examination and historical detective work, a head that had been in the possession of a family called Wilkinson since the 19th century was examined by experts and declared almost certainly to be the genuine article. It was finally given a secret burial at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, Cromwell's own college, in 1960. The exact location of the grave is not publicly disclosed, so the man who once ruled all of Britain rests in a spot that nobody outside the college is allowed to know. Cromwell's skull had a more eventful 3 centuries than most living people manage, passing through storms, fairgrounds, private collections, and scientific laboratories before finally achieving the dignity of an unmarked grave in his own college. Fact number 33. The Royalist defeat did not mean the end of a Royalist resistance. After the parliamentary victory at Nasibi in 1645 and the fall of the king's last major strongholds, organised Royalist military resistance did gradually collapse. But scattered Royalist activity continued for years. Royalist agents plotted constantly to restore the monarchy. A major Royalist uprising, called Penruddock's Rising, occurred in 1655 in Wiltshire, attracting a few hundred supporters before being quickly suppressed. The plot to assassinate Cromwell, known as the Sealed Knot Conspiracy, involved networks of Royalist agents operating in secrecy across England. Charles II spent years in exile, living in poverty in various European courts, sustained by the absolute conviction that he would one day reclaim his throne. His patience was eventually rewarded, but the waiting nearly broke him, and some of those who had promised him most delivered least when the moment finally came. The patience of Charles II during his years of exile, sustained by nothing but conviction and the charity of various European courts, was extraordinary, and when restoration finally came, it vindicated a stubbornness that in a lesser cause would simply have been called foolishness. Fact number 34. Scotland fought on multiple sides at different points in the war. Scotland's role in the English Civil War was extraordinarily complicated. The Scottish Covenanters, who had rebelled against Charles I's prayer book in the first place, and whose rebellion had forced him to call Parliament, initially allied with Parliament against the King through the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643. Scottish armies played a crucial role in the parliamentary victory at Marston Moor. But when Parliament seemed unlikely to deliver the Presbyterian church settlement Scotland had been promised, the Scots switched sides, selling the captive King Charles to Parliament for a large sum of money, and then, after the King's execution, they were horrified and immediately proclaimed his son, Charles II, as King of Scotland. Scotland then fought for the Royalist cause until Cromwell crushed the Scottish army at Dunbar in 1650 and again at Worcester in 1651. Scotland's role in this war defies any simple summary. Scotland's shifting allegiances in the Civil War reflect the genuine complexity of its political situation. A small nation trying to use a larger neighbour's crisis to secure its own religious settlement, and discovering that large neighbours are not easily used. Fact number 35. The war produced the first newspaper war in English history. The conflict was accompanied by an explosion of printed propaganda, unlike anything England had seen before. Both sides produced pamphlets, newsletters, and early newspapers at a ferocious rate. The Royalists published the newsbook Mercurius Aulicus from Oxford, the royal headquarters. Parliament replied with Mercurius Britannicus. Both publications were weapons as much as they were news sources, full of selective reporting, outright fabrication, personal attacks, and mockery. The market for printed information expanded massively during the war, and for the first time, ordinary people had access to something resembling current news about events happening elsewhere in the country. The print culture that grew up around the war helped create the conditions for modern journalism. The techniques of propaganda refined in the pamphlet wars of the 1640s are still recognizable in the media of today. The men who produced the newsbooks of the 1640s invented political journalism, complete with all its vices. Selective truth-telling, emotional manipulation, personal smear, and the systematic promotion of a partisan narrative dressed as neutral reporting. Fact number 36. John Milton was Oliver Cromwell's propaganda minister. The poet John Milton, who would go on to write Paradise Lost, one of the greatest poems in the English language, served during the interregnum as Secretary for Foreign Tongues, a position that made him essentially the official apologist and propagandist for Cromwell's regime. He wrote ferocious defences of the execution of Charles I in response to international condemnation. He engaged in pamphlet wars with European scholars who attacked the regicides. He also produced, during this period, his great defence of freedom of the press, Areopagitica, arguing against censorship. Milton was going blind during much of this time, eventually losing his sight completely. He dictated Paradise Lost to his daughters in the years after the Restoration, an epic poem many scholars read as a meditation on the failure of the English Revolution and the terrible cost of overreaching ambition. Milton's life spanned the entire arc of the Revolution, from its hopeful beginnings when he wrote in defense of Parliament and liberty, through its brutal middle years when he defended the regicide, to its bitter end when he sat blind and aging in a Restoration London that had rejected everything he had believed. Fact number 37. The war permanently changed who could worship freely in England. The collapse of royal and episcopal authority during the war years produced an extraordinary flowering of religious diversity. Sects that would have been suppressed or persecuted before the war were suddenly free to preach and organize. Quakers, Baptists, Ranters, Muggletonians, Fifth Monarchists, Seekers, and dozens of smaller groups emerged and debated ferociously. Some of these sects had beliefs that seem extraordinary, even today. The Ranters held that sin did not exist for those who were in God's spirit, that all earthly moral laws were human inventions, and that the truly free could do whatever they liked. Their opponents claimed they gathered naked, blasphemed constantly, and lived entirely without moral restraint. The reality was probably less dramatic, but still deeply unsettling to orderly society. England would never again manage to squeeze all of its religious life back into a single church. The religious pluralism produced by the Civil War was not intended by anyone on either side, but it changed England permanently, and eventually for the better, even if the immediate experience was one of bewildering and sometimes terrifying fragmentation. Fact number 38. There was a group of people called the Fifth Monarchists who believed the apocalypse was imminent. The Fifth Monarchists took their name from the book of Daniel's prophecy of 5 world monarchies, the fifth of which would be the kingdom of Jesus Christ on earth. They believed that the execution of King Charles I had destroyed the fourth monarchy, the rule of earthly kings, and that the reign of Christ was now about to begin. They expected the physical return of Jesus to rule on earth any day. They believed Cromwell was the instrument of this divine plan, and they were furious when he consistently failed to implement the godly social revolution they expected. In 1661, after the Restoration, a fifth monarchist called Thomas Venner led an armed uprising in London, expecting God to send angels to help them overthrow the restored monarchy. Venner and about 50 followers fought the army in the streets of London for 3 days before being overwhelmed. Venner was executed, still waiting for the angels. The fifth monarchists are a reminder that in a world where people genuinely believed the Bible's prophecies were being fulfilled in current events, the line between political action and apocalyptic expectation was not a line at all, but a continuous spectrum. Fact number 39. The war was partly paid for by a new form of taxation that has never really gone away. Parliamentary finance during the war was transformed by the introduction of the excise, a tax on goods consumed within England. Before the war, England had almost no domestic consumption taxes of this kind. The excise was hated from the moment it was introduced in 1643. It was seen as tyrannical, un-English, Dutch-influenced, and an assault on ordinary people's daily lives. Parliamentary pamphleteers who had complained bitterly about Charles I's ship money were embarrassed to find themselves defending taxes that were in many ways more intrusive and burdensome. The excise survived the war, survived the interregnum, survived the Restoration, and became a permanent feature of English and later British taxation. Every time you pay duty on a bottle of wine or spirits today, you are paying the direct descendant of a tax invented to fund a 17th century revolution. The excise tax, introduced to fund the parliamentary war effort, is one of the most durable legacies of the conflict, surviving every change of government and political system for nearly 4 centuries, because once a government discovers a new way to raise money, it very rarely gives it up. Fact number 40. The war produced the first written constitution in English history. In December 1653, following the collapse of the bare-bones Parliament, Oliver Cromwell's Council of Officers produced a document called the Instrument of Government. It was the first written constitution in British history, possibly the first written constitution of any modern state. It defined the powers of the Lord Protector, established a Council of State with specific powers, specified how Parliament would be elected and when it would meet, guaranteed a degree of religious toleration, and attempted to balance executive and legislative power. It was imperfect, frequently violated, and ultimately set aside. Cromwell himself struggled with and against its provisions, but it was a genuine attempt to write down the rules of government and make them binding, an idea whose time had come, even if the execution was flawed. Britain still has no single written constitution, but the instrument of government showed that the idea was not impossible. Fact number 41. Some soldiers in the war were as young as 13 or 14. The armies of the English Civil War contained significant numbers of boys. The drummer boys who kept the beat that coordinated infantry movements were often extremely young, sometimes as young as 10 or 11. But soldiers in the actual fighting ranks could be teenagers. The age of military service was far lower than modern sensibilities would find acceptable. Boys from poor backgrounds had few options, and a military wage, however unreliable, was better than nothing. Contemporary accounts describe very young faces among the dead after major battles. The trauma of violence on undeveloped minds was never considered as a category of harm. These boys were expected to fight, kill, and watch their companions die with the same stoicism as grown men. Some of them lived into old age carrying memories they could never speak about. The boy soldiers of the English Civil War are among the most invisible participants in the conflict, their youth recorded only in the occasional shocked observation of a chaplain or officer who noticed how young the dead looked after a battle. Fact number 42. Women managed estates and family businesses throughout the war. The prolonged absence of men at war, sometimes for years, created an enormous practical burden on women across England. With husbands, fathers, and brothers away fighting or dead, women had to take over the management of farms, shops, businesses, and estates. For aristocratic and gentry women, this often meant handling legal matters, negotiating with tenants, managing finances, and dealing with the occupying armies of whichever side happened to be passing through. Some women became surprisingly adept administrators and business managers. When the war ended and the men came home, or what was left of them, women were expected to step back into their traditional domestic roles. But the experience had demonstrated to many women and to some observers that the official picture of female incapacity was not entirely accurate. The war had opened a door that could never fully close again. The women who managed estates and businesses during the war had demonstrated something that could not be undemonstrated, and while the formal structures of female subordination were quickly restored, the practical knowledge of what women could do had been established beyond denial. Fact number 43. The Irish Confederation was a genuinely complex political entity. In Ireland, the 1641 uprising had led to the establishment of the Irish Catholic Confederation, also called Confederate Ireland, based in Kilkenny. This was an extraordinary institution, a self-governing council of Irish Catholic lords, clergy, and representatives that governed a substantial part of Ireland for nearly a decade. It had its own army, its own administration, its own Supreme Council, and its own General Assembly. It negotiated with foreign powers, including the papacy, France, and the Royalists. It was torn internally between those who wanted religious freedom above all and those who wanted the restoration of the old Gaelic order. Its internal divisions ultimately contributed to its failure to maintain a united resistance when Cromwell arrived in 1649. Confederate Ireland is one of the most remarkable and least known political experiments of the 17th century. Fact number 44. The siege warfare of the period could last for years. Some of the most dramatic episodes of the English Civil War were not pitched battles but sieges, and some of those sieges lasted an extraordinarily long time. Raglan Castle in Wales, one of the strongest royalist fortresses in Britain, held out until August 1646, surrendering only after the fall of Oxford made further resistance pointless. Latham House in Lancashire was besieged twice, with the Countess of Derby directing the defence of the house in her husband's absence. Donnington Castle in Berkshire changed hands multiple times and was successfully defended by the Royalists for most of the war. The psychology of siege warfare, the boredom punctuated by terror, the hunger, the disease, the constant psychological pressure on both besiegers and besieged makes it one of the most harrowing experiences the war produced. The soldiers who endured long sieges aged visibly and rapidly. Fact number 45. Plague was a constant companion of the armies. Bubonic plague had not entirely disappeared from England by the 17th century, and the movement of armies created perfect conditions for its spread. Beyond plague, typhus, known as camp fever, was the great killer of armies, spread by lice in the cramped, filthy conditions of camps and sieges. Dysentery was ubiquitous. Scurvy appeared among troops on extended campaigns with no access to fresh food. Contemporary medical understanding could do almost nothing about any of these. The surgeons of the period could amputate a limb or dress a wound reasonably well, but had no understanding of infection and no effective treatments for disease. In many campaigns of the period, disease killed more soldiers than enemy action. The men who survived the war were in many cases remarkable physical specimens, having endured conditions that killed the weaker among them. Fact number 46. The Battle of Marston Moor was the largest battle ever fought on British soil. On the 2nd of July, 1644, the two sides met at Marston Moor, near York, in the largest battle ever fought in Britain in terms of the numbers engaged. Approximately 45,000 soldiers were present on the field. The Parliamentary and Scottish army outnumbered the combined Royalist and Newcastle forces. Oliver Cromwell commanded the Parliamentary cavalry on the left wing. Despite initial setbacks in some parts of the line, Cromwell's cavalry won decisively, and he was then able to turn and strike the enemy infantry in the flank, a manoeuvre that broke the entire Royalist army. Prince Rupert, who had expected to win, fled the field. The north of England was lost to the king. Cromwell emerged from the battle as the most celebrated military commander in Parliament's service. Marston Moor is today a quiet field. The scale of what happened there is almost impossible to imagine. Fact number 47. The Battle of Naseby effectively ended the First Civil War. On the 14th of June, 1645, the New Model Army, under Fairfax and Cromwell, met the King's main field army at Naseby in Northamptonshire. The battle followed a pattern that was becoming familiar. Prince Rupert's cavalry smashed through on one flank and then, true to form, kept going and pursued the fleeing parliamentary horse far off the field. On the other flank, Cromwell's Ironsides won decisively, and then, unlike Rupert's men, wheeled and returned to attack the royalist infantry from the rear. The king's infantry was surrounded and destroyed. Almost the entire royalist army was killed or captured. The king's private correspondence was captured and later published, revealing his secret negotiations with foreign Catholic powers and doing enormous damage to his reputation. After Nicebi, the king had no army left to fight with. The First Civil War was effectively over, though the king would take another year to admit it. The publication of the king's captured correspondence after Naseby was a propaganda masterstroke that no royalist could effectively counter, since the letters were in Charles's own hand and their contents were precisely what his enemies had always claimed. Fact number 48. The word cavalier is still used in English to mean arrogantly dismissive. The political legacy of the English Civil War embedded itself in the English language in ways people rarely notice. The word cavalier, meaning dismissively casual or showing a lack of proper concern, derives directly from the contemptuous way parliamentarians used the term to describe royalist aristocrats. Roundhead became a historical curiosity, but cavalier survived and shifted meaning, carrying the ghost of 17th century political conflict into everyday modern usage. The verb to purge in a political sense, meaning to remove members from a body by force, carries echoes of Pride's purge in 1648, when Colonel Thomas Pride and his soldiers physically excluded from Parliament those members who wanted to continue negotiating with the king. Language remembers what people forget. The word cavalier carries its 17th century political insult so lightly in modern usage that almost nobody using it thinks of a royalist cavalry charge, which is how language works. It carries history invisibly, like sediment at the bottom of a river. Fact number 49. Pride's purge reduced Parliament to fewer than 100 members. In December 1648, as Parliament moved toward yet another negotiation with the captive king, the army lost patience. Colonel Thomas Pride, acting on the army's orders, stood at the door of the House of Commons with a list of names and a company of soldiers. He physically prevented approximately 186 members from entering the chamber. About 45 were arrested. The remainder, who were allowed in, became the famous Rump Parliament, the small remnant that voted to put the king on trial. This naked military interference with the democratic body that the war had supposedly been fought to protect was not lost on contemporaries. It was a profound contradiction at the heart of the revolution, one that would haunt the interregnum for its entire existence. You cannot fight a war for Parliament and then expel Parliament when it disagrees with you, and everyone in England knew it. The contradiction at the heart of Pride's purge, using military force to ensure a democratic vote against continuing negotiations with the king, is the defining contradiction of the English Revolution, and no one involved ever found a satisfactory way to explain it. Fact number 50. The royalist city of Oxford became a centre of learning and culture during the war. When the king established his wartime capital at Oxford, the university city became the headquarters of the royalist cause. The colleges were requisitioned for military purposes. The Bodleian Library's quadrangle was used as a drill ground. The mint was set up in New Inn Hall to coin money for the war. But despite, or perhaps because of its strange wartime circumstances, Oxford also became a vibrant cultural centre. Poets, playwrights, musicians and scholars gathered around the court. The king himself was a genuine art lover and patron. Oxford's fall to parliamentary forces in June 1646 marked the symbolic end of this world, as the elaborate culture of the Caroline court that had flourished around Charles I dispersed into exile and obscurity. The Oxford of those wartime years was a strange, brilliant, doomed place, and everyone who lived there knew it. Oxford during the war years was a city of contradictions. The home, simultaneously, of ancient scholarship and improvised military administration, of court poetry and military logistics, of genuine intellectual life and the daily fear of parliamentary advance. Fact number 51. The Battle of Worcester was the last battle of the entire conflict. On the 3rd of September 1651, Oliver Cromwell met the Scottish Royalist army of Charles II at Worcester. It was the final pitched battle of the three civil wars. Cromwell called it his crowning mercy. Charles II's army was completely destroyed. Charles himself, a fugitive with a price on his head, escaped only through an extraordinary 6 weeks of adventures involving hiding in an oak tree, disguising himself as a servant, and relying on a network of loyal Catholics and Royalists who sheltered him at enormous personal risk. He eventually escaped to France. Cromwell was now the unchallenged master of Britain and Ireland. The fighting was over. What remained was the nearly impossible task of building something stable out of the ruins of everything that had just been destroyed. Worcester was a more one-sided battle than its predecessor at Naseby, fought between an exhausted and outnumbered Royalist army far from its Scottish base and Cromwell's professional force on its home ground, and the result was never really in doubt. Fact number 52. Charles II hid in an oak tree to escape capture. Among the most famous episodes of the entire period is Charles II's escape after the Battle of Worcester. With Cromwell's soldiers searching the countryside and a reward of £1,000 on his head, a gigantic sum for the time, Charles and a companion climbed into a large oak tree in the grounds of Boscobel House in Shropshire and hid there for an entire day while parliamentarian troops searched the wood below. He could hear the soldiers talking. He remained motionless and silent, enduring considerable discomfort, while the search continued. The oak tree became one of the most celebrated symbols of Stuart loyalty and royal adventure. The Royal Oak public house name that appears throughout Britain is a direct commemoration of this episode. Hundreds of pubs and inns carry this name to this day, a living memorial to a king in a tree. The 6 weeks of Charles II's escape after Worcester, moving through England in disguise, hiding in barns and priest holes, relying on the loyalty of ordinary people who risked their lives to shelter him, are among the most remarkable adventures in English royal history. Fact number 53. The monarchy was restored largely through negotiation, not conquest. When Richard Cromwell resigned as Lord Protector in May 1659, the political situation in England descended into chaos as different army factions, different parliamentary groupings, and various civilian interests struggled for power with no one strong enough to dominate. General George Monk, commanding the army in Scotland, marched south in January 1660, dissolved the various parliaments that had been meeting and dissolving, arranged for elections, and allowed the Presbyterian members excluded in Pride's Purge to return to Parliament. This full Parliament then entered negotiations with Charles II, who was in exile in Breda, in the Netherlands. Charles issued the Declaration of Breda, making moderate and sensible promises about religious toleration, payment of the army's arrears, and a general amnesty. Parliament accepted. Charles returned to celebrations so joyful that they surprised even those who had planned for them. The restoration was in many ways a negotiated settlement rather than a simple return to the old order, with Charles II making promises about toleration and amnesty that he intended to keep, at least initially, and with Parliament making clear that the days of unchecked royal power were over. Fact number 54. The restoration was greeted with extraordinary public rejoicing. When Charles II entered London on his 30th birthday, the 29th of May 1660, the scenes of popular celebration were remarkable. Samuel Pepys, who witnessed the entry, described the shouting and joy expressed by all, the church bells ringing, the streets strewn with flowers and hung with tapestries. After over a decade of Puritan rule, with its restrictions on theatre, dancing, and festivity, the return of the king seemed to many people like the return of colour and life to a grey world. The fountains in London reportedly ran with wine. Bonfires blazed through the night. The day became an official holiday called Oak Apple Day or Royal Oak Day, commemorating the king's escape in the oak tree, and was celebrated annually until 1859. A whole generation exhaled after holding its breath for 11 years. The celebrations of May 1660 were real and widespread, a genuine popular expression of relief and joy. But they were also the relief of a people who had been living through a prolonged constitutional emergency and had finally been told that normal life could resume. Fact number 55. The regicides who had signed Charles I's death warrant faced terrible fates. When Charles II was restored, those who had signed his father's death warrant and were still alive faced the consequences. Charles had promised a general amnesty in the Declaration of Breda, but Parliament specifically excluded the regicides from its protection. Of the 59 who had signed the warrant, many were already dead. About 20 were still alive in England. Of these, 10 were executed. The method of execution was hanging, drawing, and quartering, the traditional punishment for treason, one of the most brutal execution methods ever devised. The rest received life imprisonment, forfeiture of estates, or were permanently barred from public office. A few had fled abroad and were hunted by royalist agents for years. They lived the rest of their lives in cold apartments in foreign cities, waiting for a knock on the door. The regicides who escaped abroad lived strange, diminished lives, maintained by the conviction that history would eventually vindicate them, writing their memoirs and waiting. Some waited a very long time. Edmund Ludlow outlived Charles II and died in Swiss exile in 1692, still unreturned and unreconciled. Fact number 56. Some regicides were executed in extraordinary ways even after death. The posthumous revenge taken on the bodies of Cromwell, Ireton, and Bradshaw, disinterred from Westminster Abbey and subjected to mock execution on the 12th anniversary of the king's death, was not unique. Edmund Ludlow, one of the surviving regicides who fled to Switzerland, lived in exile for decades and outlasted Charles II, dying in 1692. Others spent the rest of their lives in various European cities, unable to return home, surviving on charity or the remnants of their fortunes. The man who had physically presided over Charles I's trial, the lawyer John Bradshaw, was dead before the Restoration, but his corpse was exhumed, hanged, and beheaded alongside Cromwell's, his head displayed alongside the Lord Protector's on Westminster Hall. Even death offered no protection from the long memory of royal vengeance. The posthumous punishment of Cromwell, Ireton, and Bradshaw was designed to show that the restored monarchy was implacable, but it also showed that Charles II understood the power of symbols and that symbolic acts of vengeance against corpses could serve a political purpose that legal proceedings against the living could not. Fact number 57. The war transformed English agriculture permanently. The disruption of the war years, the demands of armies, the destruction of crops and livestock, the disruption of labour and trade, combined with the political and legal changes of the interregnum period, contributed to significant shifts in English agricultural organisation. The enclosure of common land, a long-running process that turned shared village commons into private fields, accelerated in the decades following the war. The destruction of many great estates and the sale of church lands and royal lands created opportunities for a new class of commercially minded farmers and investors. The digger movement's short-lived protest against enclosure and the privatization of the commons was a response to changes that were genuinely transforming the rural landscape. The traditional open field system of medieval England was in rapid retreat, and with it went a way of rural life that had existed for centuries. The enclosure movement that accelerated after the Civil War transformed the English countryside more profoundly than the battles that had preceded it, turning a landscape of open fields and common grazing into a patchwork of private property that has largely persisted to the present day. Fact number 58. The war accelerated the development of English common law. The crisis of royal authority during the war forced lawyers, judges, and legal thinkers to confront fundamental questions about the nature of English law and its relationship to royal power. The common law tradition, which held that English liberties were defined by ancient custom and precedent, rather than royal decree, was strengthened and articulated during and after the war. Figures like Edward Coke had already laid important groundwork in the years before the conflict. The interregnum's legal thinkers and the Restoration's subsequent legal settlements contributed to a tradition of rights-based English constitutionalism that would eventually influence the founding documents of the United States of America and the constitutional traditions of many other countries. The English Civil War is, in a real sense, in the bones of American law. The English common law tradition that emerged, strengthened from the Civil War, eventually crossed the Atlantic with the colonists and became the foundation of the American legal system. Which is why American courts still cite 17th century English cases, and why the English Civil War is, in a very real sense, part of American legal history. Fact number 59. The war created the professional standing army that England had never previously had. England, before the Civil War, had no standing professional army. Its defence rested on the militia, aristocratic retinues, and hired mercenaries for specific campaigns. The new model army changed this permanently. After the Restoration, Charles II kept a professional standing army, though a small one, and this became a permanent feature of the English state. The debates about standing armies, their cost, their danger to liberty, and their potential use by a tyrannical monarch against the people were fierce throughout the later 17th century and fed directly into the English Bill of Rights of 1689 and the American Second Amendment, both of which addressed the relationship between armed citizens, militias, and professional military forces. The ghost of the new model army haunted constitutional debates for generations. The new model army, as a permanent standing force, was the template from which all subsequent British armies were built, and the debates about its proper constitutional role, whether it should be controlled by Parliament or the Crown, were resolved only gradually and imperfectly over the following century. Fact number 60. The war's financial demands created the foundations of the modern British financial system. The need to fund prolonged and expensive military operations pushed both sides to innovate in finance. Parliament's ability to raise taxes more efficiently through its control of London's merchant networks gave it a crucial advantage. The interregnum period's financial pressures, and then the Restoration government's chronic shortage of money, contributed to the development of new financial instruments. The founding of the Bank of England in 1694, while technically a generation after the Civil War, grew directly from the financial lessons of the preceding half-century. The national debt, paper money, and the complex web of public and private finance that defined modern capitalism all have roots in the financial crisis of the 1640s and 1650s. The City of London that dominates global finance today is, in a distant but real sense, a creation of the Civil War. The financial innovations of the Civil War period, the excise, the assessment tax, the funded national debt, the development of paper credit, transformed England from a financially backward kingdom into the most sophisticated financial economy in Europe within a generation of the conflict ending. Fact number 61. The experience of the war shaped John Locke's political philosophy. John Locke, whose two treatises of government articulated the theory that governments derive their just authority from the consent of the governed and can be legitimately overthrown if they violate natural rights, was born in 1632 and grew up during the Civil War years. His father served as a cavalry officer in the Parliamentary Army. The questions the war raised about the limits of royal authority, the rights of subjects, and the proper basis of political obligation shaped Locke's entire intellectual development. His political philosophy, which became the foundation of liberal democratic thought, is incomprehensible without understanding the English Civil War as its context. Thomas Jefferson read Locke carefully. The Declaration of Independence is substantially Locke's ideas expressed in American terms. The English Civil War wrote the first draft of American democracy. The connection between the English Civil War and the American Revolution runs through Locke, through the Whig tradition, through the dissenting religious communities that emigrated to New England, and through the lawyers and political theorists who read English constitutional history and drew the obvious conclusions about the rights of subjects. Fact number 62. The war produced some of the most remarkable personal memoirs ever written. The literature produced by participants in the English Civil War is extraordinary, both as history and as human document. Lucy Hutchinson wrote a biography of her husband, Colonel John Hutchinson, a parliamentary commander and regicide, that is one of the finest pieces of 17th century English prose. Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, wrote the first full autobiography by a woman in English literature. Richard Baxter, a Presbyterian minister who served as a chaplain to parliamentary forces, wrote extensive and illuminating memoirs of his experiences. Edmund Ludlow, the regicide in exile, wrote memoirs that have shaped historical understanding of the period. These documents give us access to the inner lives of people navigating one of the most turbulent periods in English history. To read them is to hear the voices of the 17th century speaking directly across time. The memoirs and biographies produced by Civil War participants are among the richest collections of personal testimony from any 17th century conflict. And they continue to be read not just as historical sources, but as literature, as human documents of extraordinary quality and emotional immediacy. Fact number 63. The war was fought across an enormous variety of terrain and weather conditions. The English Civil War was not fought in one place or one season. Armies marched through summer heat and winter mud, fought sieges in freezing rain, crossed swollen rivers, and navigated landscapes from the mountains of Scotland to the bogs of Ireland to the flat fens of eastern England. The campaigns in Wales, conducted across mountainous terrain with poor roads and limited supplies, tested armies in ways that flat English battlefields did not. The Scottish campaigns of 1650 and 1651 fought in harsh northern conditions against a population that was largely hostile to the invading English army, required sustained logistical effort on a scale that tested even Cromwell's formidable organizational abilities. No two campaigns of this war were alike, and the armies that fought them had to be adaptable in ways that no previous English army had been required to be. Fact number 64. The war caused enormous destruction of religious art and architecture. Parliamentary iconoclasm, the deliberate destruction of images, statues, stained glass, and decorations considered idolatrous, was systematic and widespread during the war years. Committees of Parliament authorised the destruction of images in churches across England. Soldiers smashed medieval stained glass windows, toppled stone statues, whitewashed elaborate medieval wall paintings, stripped altars, and removed or defaced anything that smacked of Catholic religious imagery. The destruction was not universal and not everywhere equally severe, but its cumulative impact on England's medieval religious heritage was catastrophic. Centuries of devotional art, representing an enormous proportion of the visual culture of pre-Reformation England, was lost in a decade. What the Reformation had begun, the Civil War finished. The bare interiors of many English churches today are a direct consequence of what happened in the 1640s. The destruction of medieval religious art during the Civil War years was so thorough and so systematic that England today has far less surviving medieval visual culture than any comparable European country, a difference that visitors notice immediately and that shapes the entire aesthetic character of the English church interior. Fact number 65. The army held regular prayer meetings and debates among the common soldiers. The religious culture of the New Model Army was unlike anything in any European army of the period. Chaplains were assigned to regiments and preached constantly. But ordinary soldiers also organized their own prayer meetings, read the Bible together, discussed theology, and debated questions of government and society with an intensity and intellectual seriousness that was deeply unsettling to their officers and to Parliament. The army was, in a real sense, a mass democratic and religious movement as much as a military force. It produced the petitions and manifestos of the Levellers. It debated the agreement of the people at Putney. It executed a king. It dissolved Parliament. Its soldiers were not passive instruments of their commanders, but active political agents with opinions and convictions of their own. No army before or since has been quite like it. The New Model Army's culture of religious discussion and political debate among common soldiers was unique in European military history, and it produced not just the Leveller movement, but a generation of men who had been educated in democracy by the experience of arguing about it in the open air while wearing military uniforms. Fact number 66. The war was watched anxiously by every European power. The English Civil War was not an isolated event. It was observed with fascinated alarm by the courts and governments of Europe. France, still in the middle of its own Fronde, a series of aristocratic and parliamentary rebellions against royal authority, found disturbing echoes in England's troubles. Spain, a declining but still powerful Catholic monarchy, watched warily. The Dutch Republic, England's commercial rival and fellow Protestant state, was deeply interested in the outcome. The Pope, in Rome, followed events with concern. Every European power had interests in the outcome, whether in trade, religion, or the balance of continental power. When Charles I was executed, the European reaction was one of horror and a quiet recalibration of what was now possible in the world. Monarchs who had felt secure began for the first time to feel a small cold wind from England. The European powers who watched the English Civil War with such alarm were not wrong to be alarmed. The execution of Charles I was a demonstration that the traditional order of kings, nobles, and churches was not permanent, inevitable, or even necessarily rational, and that demonstration could not be unseen. Fact number 67. The war created the first professional female writers in England. The collapse of the licensing system that had controlled printing during the war years, combined with the general upheaval of traditional social roles, created unprecedented opportunities for women writers and publishers. Women had written before, of course, but primarily for private circulation. During the war and interregnum period, women began publishing their religious visions, their political opinions, their personal testimonies, and their poetry. Quaker women in particular published extensively, believing that the Spirit of God spoke through them, regardless of their sex. The tradition of women's public writing that emerged from this period, however suppressed and marginalized it subsequently became, represented a significant crack in the patriarchal control of public discourse. The war did not liberate women, but it made their liberation somewhat more conceivable than it had been before. The women writers who emerged during the Civil War years represent the first substantial wave of female public authorship in English history, and the tradition they established, however interrupted and suppressed in subsequent generations, never entirely disappeared and eventually became the mainstream. Fact number 68. The war's aftermath shaped the settlement that became known as the Glorious Revolution. The Restoration of 1660 did not resolve the fundamental constitutional questions that the Civil War had raised. It simply postponed them. Charles II and his brother James II continued to push the boundaries of royal power, to favour Catholics in public life and to resist parliamentary constraints. The crisis finally came in 1688, when James II was deposed in the Glorious Revolution, and William and Mary were installed as constitutional monarchs. The English Bill of Rights of 1689, which defined the constitutional relationship between monarch and parliament, was the final settlement of the arguments that had begun in 1640. The Civil War did not resolve the constitutional crisis. The Glorious Revolution did, but neither could have happened without the other, and both were necessary to produce the constitutional settlement that shaped the modern English-speaking world. Fact number 69. The Scottish Covenanters produced extraordinary religious literature. The Scottish Presbyterian movement that had triggered the whole crisis with its resistance to Charles I's prayer book produced a remarkable body of religious writing. The National Covenant of 1638 and the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643 were not just political documents, but statements of religious identity of enormous emotional power. The Covenanting movement generated sermons, testimonies, diaries, and theological treatises that shaped Scottish religious and national identity for generations. The Covenanters, who were persecuted after the Restoration for refusing to renounce the covenants, produced martyrdom narratives and testimony, literature that became foundational texts of Scottish Presbyterian culture and of the broader tradition of dissenting religious writing in the English-speaking world. That tradition eventually crossed the Atlantic and shaped American religious culture in ways still visible today. Fact number 70. Thousands of people emigrated to the American colonies to escape the conflict. The religious and political turmoil of the 1630s and 1640s drove significant numbers of English men and women to emigrate to the American colonies. The Great Migration to New England, which brought approximately 20,000 settlers between 1620 and 1640, was largely driven by Puritans fleeing a religious environment they found oppressive under Charles I's church policies. The Royalist defeat prompted a different wave of emigration, as younger sons of Royalist families left an England controlled by their enemies and sought their fortunes in Virginia and other colonies. The political and religious DNA of early America was substantially shaped by these migrations, bringing to the New World both Puritan ideas of covenant community and Cavalier ideas of hierarchical social order. America was born partly from England's failure to resolve its own contradictions at home. Fact number 71. The war's sieges produced extraordinary engineering. The military technology of the 17th century, inherited from the continental wars of the preceding century, had developed sophisticated techniques of siege warfare. The attackers would dig approach trenches, construct artillery batteries, build elaborate earthworks to protect their gun positions, and methodically blast holes in defensive walls. The defenders would construct inner lines of defense, mount desperate sorties to disrupt the besiegers' works, use fire and flooding to slow the approaches, and in extreme cases, mine under the attackers' trenches. The earthwork fortifications thrown up around parliamentary-held towns and royalist strongholds all over England were enormous undertakings. Some have left traces in the landscape that are still visible today as subtle earthen humps and ridges in fields and parks. The war wrote itself into the soil of England, and parts of it are still there. The earthworks of the Civil War that survive in English fields and parks are among the most tangible physical remains of the conflict. And walking over them on a quiet afternoon while watching rabbits cross the grass, it is almost impossible to imagine the industry and fear that created them. Fact number 72. The war created some very unlikely heroes. The English Civil War produced heroes from every level of society and from entirely unexpected quarters. A Lincolnshire farmer named John Lilburne became the most famous pamphleteer and agitator of the age, imprisoned multiple times by both king and parliament for his writing, tried for his life and acquitted by a jury that defied the court, and ultimately transported. A Welsh royalist officer named Sir Jacob Astley, surrendering to parliamentarian forces after the Battle of Stow-on-the-Wold in 1646, reportedly addressed his captors with elegant resignation, telling them that they had done their work and might go play, unless they would fall out among themselves. A remarkably prescient observation about what would indeed happen to the parliamentary cause within just a few years. Heroes come in unexpected forms when a world is breaking apart. John Lilburne's career is one of the most remarkable in English history. A man who quarrelled with every authority he encountered, was imprisoned by king, parliament, and protector in succession, and spent his entire adult life fighting for liberties that most people around him were prepared to compromise. Fact number 73. The Navy was crucial and mostly sided with Parliament from the start. England's Navy was a decisive factor in the war, and Parliament controlled it from almost the beginning. The fleet provided Parliament with strategic mobility, the ability to resupply besieged ports, deny coastal supply routes to the Royalists, and maintain contact with commercial partners. A Royalist navy, formed from ships and officers who defected, fought against Parliament during the Second Civil War, but was generally outclassed and eventually driven from English waters. The Prince of Wales, the future Charles II, sailed with this fleet for a time in an effort to raise support. But parliamentary naval dominance, maintained by effective administration and the loyalty of most senior naval officers, was never seriously threatened. It gave Parliament a strategic advantage throughout the conflict that no amount of Royalist cavalry brilliance on land could compensate for. Fact number 74. The war was accompanied by a spectacular witch-hunting epidemic. The disruption of traditional authority during the war years created fertile conditions for witch-hunting panics. In East Anglia, between 1644 and 1647, a self-appointed witchfinder named Matthew Hopkins, styling himself the Witchfinder General, accused hundreds of people of witchcraft in a campaign that resulted in more executions for witchcraft in England in 2 years than in the previous 100. Hopkins used tactics including sleep deprivation and forced swimming to extract confessions. He was eventually challenged on his methods, questioned under the same logic he applied to his victims, and died in 1647, apparently of tuberculosis. His campaign illustrates how the collapse of normal social order during the war years could release forces of communal fear and accusation that were normally held in check. When authority breaks down, something always rushes in to fill the vacuum. Fact number 75. The interregnum saw extraordinary experiments in education. The period of the Commonwealth and Protectorate produced genuine interest in educational reform. Samuel Hartlib, a Polish-born reformer operating in England, corresponded with every important intellectual of the age and produced a stream of proposals for reforming schools, universities, and the transmission of knowledge. John Milton wrote Tractate of Education, proposing a comprehensive humanist curriculum. Radical groups demanded free education for all. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge were reformed, with new fellows appointed on merit rather than patronage. Durham University was briefly established during the interregnum, only to be abolished at the Restoration. The energy of the period, its conviction that the world could be rebuilt from first principles, produced an intense engagement with the question of how to educate citizens for a new kind of society. Most of the experiments failed, but they planted seeds. The educational reform movement of the interregnum produced more proposals than achievements. but the proposals themselves were remarkable, anticipating many of the educational changes that would eventually be implemented in the 19th and 20th centuries, suggesting that the ideas were right, even if the moment was wrong. Fact number 76. The war changed fashion and personal appearance across England. The sartorial divide between Cavaliers and Roundheads, however exaggerated in popular memory, reflected real differences in personal style that the war years reinforced and politicized. Royalist culture valued long flowing hair, elaborate lace collars, brightly coloured clothing, silk and velvet, and the general aesthetic of luxury and display that characterized the Caroline court. Puritan culture valued plain dress, dark colours, short hair, plain linen collars, and the visible rejection of worldly vanity. During the interregnum, Puritan styles dominated public life. The Restoration brought back the lace and the long hair with a vengeance. Charles II and his court set a tone of extravagant fashion that was partly a deliberate rejection of everything Puritan. The politics of the period were written in cloth and hair as clearly as they were written in pamphlets and petitions. The sartorial politics of the Civil War period are a reminder that dress is never politically neutral, that what people wear on their bodies is a statement about who they are and what they believe, and that in times of political crisis, clothing becomes a kind of uniform even for civilians. Fact number 77. The horse was the decisive weapon of the war. In the tactical context of the 17th century warfare, cavalry was king. The outcome of almost every major battle of the English Civil War was determined by the performance of cavalry. Prince Rupert's devastating charges won early battles, but his cavalry's failure to rally after success repeatedly cost the Royalists decisive victories. Cromwell's genius was in creating cavalry, his Ironsides that could charge with equal ferocity, but then rally, reform, and return to the fight rather than pursuing defeated enemies off the field. This combination of aggression and discipline was extraordinarily difficult to achieve and was the product of months of intensive training and the religious conviction that gave Cromwell's men a sense of purpose that sustained their cohesion even in the chaos of battle. Rupert had the better horsemen. Cromwell had the better soldiers. Fact number 78. The war was a catastrophe for the civilian population. Military historians focus on battles, but the ordinary people of England experienced the war primarily through the demands of armies passing through their communities. Soldiers on both sides routinely seized food, fodder, horses, carts, and anything else they needed from the surrounding countryside, sometimes paying in worthless receipts, often taking without any payment at all. Farms were stripped bare, livestock was driven away, stored grain was consumed or destroyed. Houses were requisitioned, damaged or burned. The cumulative economic damage to the English countryside was enormous. In some regions, particularly those repeatedly fought over, the economic impact was visible for decades. Contemporary estimates suggest that the death toll from the war, including disease and famine as well as battle casualties, amounted to a higher proportion of the English population than the First World War. The ordinary farmer and the market trader bore the heaviest cost of a war they had rarely chosen. The civilian population of England suffered the Civil War primarily as a series of unpredictable visitations, armies appearing from nowhere to demand food, horses, and shelter, leaving behind stripped larders, requisitioned carts, and the memory of faces that looked like neighbours but acted like occupiers. Fact number 79. The war produced the first real debates about freedom of the press. The collapse of royal censorship in the early 1640s and the explosion of pamphlet publishing that followed created an entirely new situation. For a brief and chaotic period, printing was effectively unregulated. Anything could be and was published. Parliament, embarrassed by the flood of radical and sometimes scandalous pamphlets, attempted to reimpose licensing through the licensing order of 1643. John Milton wrote Areopagitica in response, one of the most eloquent defenses of press freedom in any language, arguing that truth needed no licensing because in a free contest of ideas it would always prevail. The debate between the ideal of free expression and the authorities' desire to control dangerous speech has continued ever since and is still lived today. Milton's argument has never been bettered, which is why people are still quoting it, nearly 400 years later. The Areopagitica is one of the great arguments for freedom of expression in any language, and its central claim that truth does not need protection from error because it will always win in a free contest of ideas, is an optimistic assertion that every generation has to decide for itself whether it believes. Fact number 80. The Quaker movement was born from the war's religious ferment. George Fox began his preaching in the late 1640s, drawing on the intense religious searching of the war years. The movement he founded, the Society of Friends or Quakers, rejected all external religious authority, all church hierarchy, all sacraments, all paid clergy, and held that the inner light of God spoke directly to every individual regardless of sex or social status. Quakers refused to doff their hats to social superiors, refused to take oaths, refused military service, and suffered enormous persecution as a result. The early Quaker movement was associated in the public mind with wild enthusiasm and social disorder. Over time, it evolved into the mild, peaceful, socially concerned society that built Cadbury's, chocolate and Barclays Bank. But its origins were in the firestorm of the Civil War years and its founding conviction that every human being has equal direct access to the divine is one of the most radical ideas in the history of religion. The Quakers' insistence on the equality of all believers before God was the most radical religious claim of the 17th century, and the persecution they endured for it demonstrates how genuinely threatening that claim was to a society organized on the assumption of hierarchical difference. Fact number 81. Charles I's trial was legally problematic from beginning to end. The legal basis of the trial of Charles I was deeply contested at the time and has been debated by legal historians ever since. The High Court of Justice, established to try him, was created by the Rump Parliament alone, without the House of Lords and without royal assent, in defiance of the normal constitutional rules for legislation. Many senior lawyers refused to have anything to do with it. The court's jurisdiction was invented specifically for this occasion. Charles's own legal challenge, that no court had authority to try a king, was never answered in law, only overridden by force. The trial has therefore been described variously as a revolutionary act of popular sovereignty, a straightforward exercise of military power, dressed in legal costume, and the foundational moment of the modern idea that rulers are accountable to law. It was probably all three things simultaneously. The legal improvisations of the trial of Charles I were not a failure of legal thinking, but a demonstration of it. The prosecutors knew exactly what they were doing and why, even if they could not make their reasoning fit into the existing categories of English law. Fact number 82. The war was partly about money owed to the Scottish army. One of the most prosaic and inglorious episodes of the war was the sale of King Charles I by the Scots to Parliament. After the king surrendered to the Scottish army at Newark in May 1646, believing he could play them off against Parliament, he spent months in Scottish custody, trying to get them to restore him to full power. When it became clear that Charles would not accept the Presbyterian church settlement the Scots required, and when Parliament offered to pay the money owed to the Scottish army for its service, the Scots handed the king over to Parliament in exchange for the payment of their arrears, approximately £400,000. The king described this as being sold. His supporters were horrified. The Scots defended it as a practical settlement of a debt. History has never quite decided who was right or whether the question even has a clean answer. The sale of the king by the Scots is one of those historical episodes that sees every party to it described in terms that were simultaneously self-serving and not entirely wrong. And the discomfort it causes today is a fair reflection of the discomfort it caused at the time. Fact number 83. The war saw the first use of newspapers as systematic propaganda. Both the royalist Mercurius Aulicus and the parliamentarian Mercurius Britannicus were not simply news publications. They were sophisticated propaganda operations designed to shape public opinion, undermine the enemy's credibility, and maintain morale among their own supporters. They reported victories, minimized defeats, attacked enemy leaders personally, and shaped narratives. The royalist publication, edited from Oxford by John Birkenhead, was widely read and admired even by its enemies for its wit and literary quality. The parliamentary publications were less polished but more numerous. The techniques they developed, selective reporting, personal attacks, emotional language, stirring narratives of heroism, were the foundation on which all subsequent media propaganda was built. Every political spin operation in the world today is a descendant of what Birkenhead and his rivals invented in the 1640s. The war journalists of the 1640s discovered that their readers wanted narrative and emotion as much as information, that a story well told would travel further and be believed more readily than a dry recitation of facts, and that in this discovery lay both the greatest power and the greatest danger of the press. Fact number 84. The war created a generation of veterans who shaped the following century. The men who fought in the English Civil War as young men lived on in significant numbers into the Restoration period and beyond. They carried with them the experiences, beliefs, and resentments of the war. Veterans of the New Model Army were present in the dissenting congregations that maintained a tradition of nonconformity throughout the Restoration period. Former officers appeared in the plannings of the Monmouth Rebellion of 1685 and in the conspiracies that preceded the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The generational memory of the war, transmitted through families and communities, shaped English political culture for at least a century after the fighting ended. Wars do not end when the shooting stops. They end, if they end at all, when the last person who remembers them is gone. Fact number 85. The war transformed English poetry. The English Civil War produced, in the generation that fought or lived through it, some of the greatest poetry in the language. John Milton, Andrew Marvell, Abraham Cowley, and Richard Lovelace all engaged directly with the themes of the war, power, liberty, martyrdom, exile, and the nature of heroism. Lovelace, a royalist officer imprisoned by Parliament, wrote some of the most celebrated lyric poetry of the century, including To Althea, from prison, with its famous lines about minds innocent and quiet, taking the tower of a prison, and the idea that stone walls do not a prison make. Marvell, who served as tutor in a parliamentary household while writing some of the most politically complex poetry of the age, eventually became Latin secretary to Cromwell and then a member of Parliament for Hull. The war hurt these men and made them into poets in the same motion. Lovelace wrote his most famous poems while imprisoned by Parliament, turning the experience of incarceration into an argument for the indestructibility of a free mind. And if there is a single poem that captures what the Cavalier cause believed about itself at its best, it is probably To Althea, from prison. Fact number 86. The war's violence was often personal and intimate. The English Civil War was not fought between professional soldiers who did not know each other. It was fought between neighbours, between brothers, between fathers and sons, between men who had gone to school together, worshipped in the same churches, hunted in the same fields. The war divided families in ways that later English history would only parallel in the bitter sectarian conflicts of Ireland. Families like the Verneys of Buckinghamshire saw father and son fight on opposite sides. Communities that had functioned on the basis of mutual knowledge and trust found themselves divided by military occupation and the terrible intimacy of civil conflict. The psychological wounds left by this were deep and slow to heal. When the war finally ended, neighbors had to look each other in the eye and find a way to go on. Most of them managed it, somehow. The intimacy of the violence, the fact that men killed people they knew in places they recognized, gave the English Civil War a character quite different from the anonymous industrial slaughter of modern warfare. And the psychological literature of the period, though it does not use the language of trauma, describes its effects with unmistakable accuracy. Fact number 87. The interregnum saw real attempts at law reform. One of the genuine achievements of the interregnum period, albeit incomplete and ultimately reversed, was the serious attempt at law reform. The common law courts of England were notoriously slow, expensive, and inaccessible to ordinary people. The Chancery Court, in particular, had a reputation for grinding on for decades without resolution. The Rump Parliament, the Barebones Parliament, and various committees under the Protectorate all produced proposals for radical legal reform. The Hale Commission, under Matthew Hale, produced comprehensive recommendations for simplifying procedure, reducing costs, and making justice more accessible. Most of these reforms were blocked, weakened, or ultimately abandoned at the Restoration. But the debate laid the groundwork for the law reforms of the 19th century and demonstrated that the legal system's problems were not inevitable, but chosen. Fact number 88. The war was a turning point in the history of religious toleration. England, before the Civil War, was a country that persecuted religious dissent. Nonconformists, Catholics, separatists, and those who deviated from the established church faced legal disabilities, fines, imprisonment, and in extreme cases, execution. The war produced, despite itself, a degree of religious pluralism that could never entirely be reversed. The inability of any single religious group to dominate after the collapse of the established church meant that various groups had to coexist, however uneasily. Cromwell's protectorate maintained a degree of religious toleration unusual for the time, allowing Jews to return to England for the first time since 1290. While full religious liberty was not achieved, the direction of travel was set, and no subsequent English government has ever managed to reduce religious diversity to the uniformity that existed before the war. The degree of religious toleration maintained by Cromwell's protectorate was not idealistic, but pragmatic. In a country where no single religious group was strong enough to dominate, toleration was the only alternative to permanent civil war, and Cromwell was intelligent enough to see that, even if he could not always bring himself to act on it consistently. Fact number 89. The Battle of Dunbar was one of Cromwell's most extraordinary victories. In September 1650, Oliver Cromwell's army invaded Scotland and found itself in a desperate position. Outnumbered by the Scottish Covenanting army, hemmed in against the sea near Dunbar, with disease reducing his forces daily and his supply lines stretched, Cromwell was in serious trouble. The Scottish general David Leslie had Cromwell's army in a potentially decisive trap. But Leslie's ministers pressured him to advance down from the heights and attack immediately, believing God would deliver victory to the godly Covenanters. When the Scots descended to the lower ground, Cromwell seized the opportunity, attacked at dawn on the 3rd of September, and utterly destroyed an army more than twice the size of his own. He lost perhaps 30 men, killed. The Scots lost approximately 4,000 dead and 10,000 prisoners. Cromwell described it in his dispatch as the mercy of God. He may have been right. Fact number 90. The war saw innovations in medical practice forced by necessity. Military surgeons of the English Civil War era worked at the absolute frontier of contemporary medical knowledge. Amputation was the standard treatment for severe limb wounds, performed at speed, without anesthetic, and with instruments sterilized only by fire, if at all. The survival rate after amputation was better than many imagine, perhaps 60 to 70% in the better conditions, though much lower in the field. Some surgeons experimented with treating wounds more conservatively, avoiding amputation where possible. Blood transfusion was attempted experimentally in this period, though with mixed and sometimes fatal results. The enormous experience of treating battlefield wounds that the war provided contributed to advances in surgical technique and to the growing interest in anatomy and physiology that characterized the scientific revolution. The suffering of soldiers in the 1640s improved the medicine available to everyone who came after them. The medical advances forced by the Civil War were not always recognized as such at the time, but the surgeons who had operated on hundreds of battlefield casualties had acquired a practical knowledge of wounds and their treatment that no peacetime medical career could have provided. Fact number 91. The war changed how England was governed at the local level. One of the most significant and lasting effects of the war was the destruction of the traditional mechanisms of local government. The justices of the peace, drawn from the county gentry, had been the backbone of English local administration for centuries. The war disrupted this system profoundly. Many JPS were removed as politically unreliable and replaced. The sequestration committees that managed the estates of defeated royalists brought new men into local power. The major generals whom Cromwell appointed in 1655 to govern England's regions directly, dividing the country into 11 military districts, each under a senior officer, represented an unprecedented extension of central governmental power into local life. The major general system was intensely hated and lasted only 2 years, but it left behind a changed administrative landscape and a deep popular suspicion of centralized military power that lasted much longer. The major generals were the most openly authoritarian experiment of the interregnum, and their brief rule confirmed for the English public that military government was precisely what the Civil War had supposedly been fought to prevent, which made their abolition a popular relief even among people who had no love for the restored parliament that replaced them. Fact number 92. Wales was substantially royalist, but produced important parliamentary figures. Wales as a whole was largely royalist in the Civil War, with Welsh troops forming a significant component of the king's armies. The great Welsh castles, Raglan, Harlech and Chirk, among others, were royalist strongholds that held out long after English resistance had collapsed. But Wales also produced important figures on the parliamentary side. The Propagation Act of 1650 established an ambitious scheme for Puritan evangelization of Wales, deploying itinerant preachers across the country with the aim of creating a godly Welsh population. The result was complicated, producing both genuine religious conversion and deep resentment. The tradition of Welsh nonconformity that would shape Welsh culture for the next 3 centuries has its roots partly in this traumatic period, giving Wales one of the most distinctive religious cultures in the entire English-speaking world. Welsh nonconformity, the tradition of passionate dissenting Protestantism that produced the Great Revival movements and the chapel culture of the 18th and 19th centuries, grew directly from the disruption of the traditional Welsh church during the Civil War and interregnum period. Fact number 93. The war produced the first significant standing navy in English history. The English Navy, before the Civil War, was a significant force, but not the dominant sea power that England would later become. Parliament's control of the Navy from the start of the war gave it a strategic advantage that was crucial in maintaining the supply of London and denying the Royalists access to the sea. Under the Commonwealth and Protectorate, the Navy was massively expanded and professionalised. The First and Second Dutch Wars, fought by the Commonwealth and then by the restored monarchy, were fought by a navy that had been built and trained during the interregnum. Robert Blake, the Commonwealth's greatest admiral, was a former MP and amateur soldier who turned himself into one of the finest naval commanders in English history. He is another example of the extraordinary human transformation that the war made possible. The ordinary man revealed as extraordinary by the pressure of extraordinary times. Fact number 94. The war was deeply influenced by the experience of continental warfare. England had been relatively insulated from the catastrophic wars of the continent before the Civil War. But many of the senior officers on both sides had served in the 30 Years' War in Germany, which had devastated large parts of Central Europe. Prince Rupert had fought in Germany and brought continental cavalry tactics to England. Parliamentary officers had also served abroad and studied the latest military techniques. The professionalism of the new model army owed something to continental models, but England also differed crucially from the continent in that the war was fought between fellow countrymen who shared a language, a legal tradition, and, however imperfectly, a religion. The restraints on violence that this mutual recognition imposed were real, even if frequently violated. England's civil war was brutal, but it was not the 30 Years' War. Fact number 95. The war's memory was used by every subsequent generation for its own purposes. The memory of the English Civil War has been argued over and reinterpreted by every generation since 1660. Royalists used it to argue for the sanctity of monarchy and the horrors of popular rebellion. Whigs used it to argue for parliamentary supremacy and the rights of subjects. Radicals used the Levellers and Diggers as precursors of modern democracy and socialism. American revolutionaries cited the English Civil War as a precedent for resisting tyranny. Victorian liberals celebrated Cromwell as a hero of Protestant liberty. The war has been a kind of vast mirror in which successive generations see their own political anxieties and aspirations reflected back at them. It has never stopped being politically relevant because the questions it raised have never received final answers. Fact number 96. The war produced the concept of the loyal opposition. The English Civil War, paradoxically, eventually contributed to the development of the idea that political opposition could be legitimate and loyal rather than treasonous. The experience of the war, with its factions and its shifting alliances and its ultimate failure to produce a stable settlement, gradually taught English political culture that opposition to the government was not the same as opposition to the state. The development of the Whig and Tory parties in the Restoration period, and their gradual evolution into a system where one party governed and the other opposed and waited for its turn, grew from this traumatic education in the necessity of political pluralism. The British parliamentary system of government and official opposition is a direct descendant of the Civil War's legacy. Democracy requires the losing side to accept defeat. England learned that the hard way. Fact number 97. The last military garrison of the war held out until 1651, while the Battle of Worcester in September 1651 is generally considered the final military action of the Civil Wars. Some royalist positions continued to hold out even after Charles II's defeat. The island of Jersey, a possession of the English crown that had been a royalist stronghold throughout the war, held out under Governor Sir George Carteret until December 1651, when it finally negotiated a surrender on terms. The Channel Islands had been a significant base for royalist privateering and a refuge for the court in exile. Their final surrender represented the last formal capitulation of the war, a quiet end to a conflict that had begun with such violence and fury a decade before. A stool thrown in a Scottish church in 1637 had set in motion a chain of events that only ended here, on a small island in the English Channel, 14 years later. Fact number 98. The war's religious settlement left England permanently divided. The Church of England that emerged from the Restoration was not the same Church of England that had gone into the Civil War. The Clarendon Code, passed by the Cavalier Parliament in the early 1660s, imposed strict legal penalties on nonconformists who refused to accept the restored Episcopal Church. The Act of Uniformity of 1662 expelled approximately 2,000 ministers who refused to submit to episcopal ordination, creating the tradition of Protestant nonconformity that would be a permanent feature of English religious life. Methodism, Congregationalism, Presbyterianism outside England, the Baptist tradition, and many other streams of English Protestant Christianity all trace their organized existence to the Great Ejection of 1662, which was itself the consequence of the religious conflict that the Civil War had both expressed and intensified. The Church of England today is still living with the fractures the war created. Fact number 99. The English Civil War was the moment when the modern world began to emerge. It is not an exaggeration to say that the English Civil War was one of the pivotal events in the creation of the modern world. It established the principle that monarchs are not above the law. It demonstrated that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed and can be held accountable for abusing it. It produced the first experiments with written constitutions and representative government. It generated traditions of free press, free speech, and religious toleration that, however imperfect in their original form, became foundational principles of modern democracy. Its ideas traveled to America and became the intellectual foundation of the American Revolution. They traveled further still, shaping the French Revolution, the revolutionary tradition of the 19th century, and the democratic movements of the 20th. The wars are over. The argument that started them, in 1640, has still not ended yet. From witch-finders stalking the fens of East Anglia to a poodle celebrated as a supernatural familiar, from a king choosing his shirts with care on the morning of his own beheading, to a skull passing through fairground stalls and private collections across 3 centuries, before finding a quiet grave at Cambridge. The English Civil War is one of the strangest, most human, and most consequential stories in the history of the world. It gave us the idea that rulers can be held to account. It gave us the beginnings of the free press, of religious toleration, and of written constitutions. It asked questions about who should govern and on what terms that have never stopped being asked. The fighting ended in 1651. The argument never did. If these facts kept you company tonight, we will see you in the next one.